Okay, an interesting little video coming up. I got a workmate here who wants to learn to TIG weld, which is good because I think it's good to sort of that someone else takes on some of the jobs, you know, the more interesting jobs. So what we did anyway is we first of all started running some beads without filler, just so you can see his first one here. He got a bit thin at the start, and then as the heat builds up he gets going. Eventually we got him running a nice constant width straight line bead on a bit of steel, and we got some arc shots of that and some film. I think it's quite an interesting video this time. A bit of waffling, but worth watching if you're a beginner to TIG welding. Some typical things that happen when you first start out happened, and on the other side of this plate we started adding some filler rod. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, the first thing that needs to be done when you're TIG welding, most types of welding, but particularly with TIG welding, is to have clean, bright metal. And you've got to get rid of all that mill scale. This is a bit of old hot rolled plate that we got for practice. It's got a thick coating of mill scale on it, and that needs to be got rid of if you want to have a clean looking weld, basically, and not a mess. So particularly important, cleanliness.
So wiping that down with acetone now. I'm not videoing your face. You have to do a talk over now because you've got me fucking blurbing on.
Right, TIG welding. Someone who wants to learn to TIG weld, someone you can see. We'll start with the basics, not too basic, but the torch. Okay, there was too much of me waffling here, so we cut this bit down a bit. I'm sort of explaining the torch, but basically all you need to know is that I'm using a WP20 torch that's like the size of a 9 or a 20. This one's water cooled, and I'm using a standard gas lens on it with a number 7 cup, and that will do 90% of what most people probably want to do. It's a 3/32 electrode, and again that will do most things from very thin to very thick if you know how to sharpen it and maintain it. That's something we'll get into in another video. It is important, but it's a lot to take into this video. If you have the bigger torch, if you're buying a new machine, you have the bigger torch, the 17 style, which a lot of them come with now, I recommend the stubby gasland kit, which you can get from Jody at weldmonger.com. We're just assembling the torch there and explaining a little bit about it, how to hold it. I'll bring you back. Ideally you would keep the torch pointing straight down at the metal.
Okay.
But then you can't see what you're doing. If you tilt it just a little bit and bring your head down, you can see what you're doing, and you can sneak your filler rod in just from the side there.
So to the side?
Yeah, normally in front. If you're moving in this direction, okay, you feed filler into what we call the leading edge of the puddle, the molten pool, like that. And you don't want to pull the filler rod out too far each time, because the hot tip will come out of the shielding gas and it'll be oxidized, and when you put it back in you'll contaminate the weld. So okay, it's a very small, a very gentle dip, 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 not
yep, keep it in that gas.
Keeping it in that
yep,
gas cloud, which is somewhere under the lens there. So I guess what we should do is give you the torch.
Right.
Fire up the machine.
Oh God.
We'll set the amps roughly, maximum amps for this, roughly this thickness of metal. We've got a foot pedal on the floor that actually controls the amps and the starting of the torch. The more you press it, the more amps you get, the more quickly and the bigger the puddle will form, and the more likely you are to burn right through if you go crazy with it. So first of all, press the pedal, start the arc, watch how the paddle sort of widens and grows as you add more amps, and then start moving and try and just make a puddle of a constant width.
How would you know that you've got too many amps?
If you're welding on thin metal, you'll burn right through it. When you get going,
Yeah.
If the bead looks kind of flat, the weld bead looks kind of flat, and it's sinking and it's penetrating quite a lot, that's a bit too much. If the weld bead is kind of crowned up and high, tall, and with sharp edges, not wetted into where the edges, not enough amps, you're welding too cold. And there's a sort of rule of thumb for starting, up to about 1/8 of an inch, you use an amp for every 1,000th of material you've got.
Right.
So 1/8 of an inch would be 125 amps.
Okay.
So when you set the machine for that, when you floor the pedal you get 125 amps. As it all gets hot and you get going, you may find you need to back off just a little bit.
Right.
To keep the bead a nice constant width. But we'll start off just by running some beads, intentionally straight beads maybe, on a steel plate, and just see how it goes.
Good.
So, yeah, how do you hold the torch? Well, most people tend to grip it kind of like a pencil here. If you really got to rest and you're welding very thin stuff, you might want to use your pinky and prop there, but if you're welding anything that's going to get hot, you need to be a bit further back. And you do need to be comfortable, because you need to hold a really accurate arc length, so you're going to need to rest your hand on something and just drag slowly. So generally I think a bit like a pencil from there is a good start.
Okay.
And that's looking hopeful. So if you take a dry run, another question is going to be the arc length. Well,
Yeah.
that's something that experience will tell you. Fairly short, probably not too much more than the 3/32 diameter of the tungsten for a start. So lift up a couple of millimeters, avoid touching, and just make small. So maybe hold an arc length.
You show me.
Something like that. And just make a gentle travel. Let's just run a bead without filler and see how it goes.
Well, what I found was that because I started off with my arm in the wrong position, as I moved along the line it became more and more uncomfortable, and I sort of had to stretch my arm round. So
that's a common problem. A lot of people, when they start out, they can only weld an inch or two at a time. The thing to do is to find something that will slide nicely. Like anything will do really. A bit of cloth, heat-proof cloth, or a TIG finger, which I've got somewhere here. Alright, I haven't got a TIG finger. Something that will slide and let your arm move comfortably in a straight line, or let your whole hand move.
So I think a dry run as well
is always a good idea.
Make sure that,
if you want to go in a straight line, it's always, that's it, slide like that.
Yeah, because if you pivot, then obviously you're going to create an arc.
And get yourself something to rest on that slides nice and smoothly. That's a good tip for a start. You can see how the more you press the pedal, the wider the bead gets. When you get roughly the thickness of the material is often good. So
So with the swells, I mean, this sort of area here,
that's the trailing edge of the puddle, and each time you move along you'll leave a little horseshoe shape.
And is there a desired sort of amount of...
Not really. Depends what you're welding, how much filler you're using, how often you need to dip the filler rod in. Most people aim for, say, 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch move with each dip of filler rod, but it's something that just comes with time and how you want the weld to look and how much filler you need to add.
I want it to look like my rally bicycle.
Yeah, well then you're looking at something like this, which is between 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch a move with every dip. The more consistent you can be, the better it'll look. We haven't added any filler at this stage. That was just a practice with the pedal. But you can see each time you move the torch, you leave a little horseshoe shape on the trailing edge of the puddle, which is what everybody wants to see on welds.
And again, I felt myself, probably because I've been watching you sort of, but I might have got it wrong in my head, but I felt myself kind of jumping to the next spot. Is it better to do that, or to just try and keep a sort of constant?
Keep it fairly constant for start. With some materials, when you add filler rod to the puddle will grow, and if the puddle touches the electrode, so some materials, especially on aluminium, you do need to just lift it a fraction as you dip.
Right.
But steel normally is okay in most positions. Okay. If you hold it, you don't have to hold the arc so tight that puddle will crush the electrode. With aluminium it does happen because the puddle kind of grows more when you add filler.
Okay.
Alright, this is a practice bead that he's just running with no filler wire. We're just aiming to get enough heat at the beginning to grow a puddle to the desired width, and then keep it that width and run a fairly straight line. Yeah, I think it's looking good. Yeah. Yeah. Bit closer. That's better.
That's a better one.
That's better. You can sort of see with your first few beads, you need more heat at the beginning until the puddle gets going. The first few beads, but that last one, you obviously started off quite hot and gradually backed off the gas and got a fairly constant width. I think maybe the next thing to do is to add some filler metal and then join two bits of metal together.
It's a lot harder than it looks. That's all I'll say.
It'll come. I mean, that's quite good to get an arc going. A reasonably straight line, a reasonably constant width is a good start.
Okay.
So I guess the next thing is going to be to add some filler metal. There's 3 or 4 things with TIG welding that you need to observe, I think, in the first few years. One is to keep the arc nice and tight, not to let the torch come away. One is not to have too much torch angle, keep it as directly down as you possibly can. The next one is to keep the hot tip of the rod shielded under there, don't take it out too far. And the last one is to develop a reasonably good feed hand technique. That means you won't be going closer, run out of wire and piss yourself because your hands are on fire. So you want to have it so that you can feed it reasonably accurately with each dip through your hand. Most people go like that. It just seems kind of easy. Even with a thick glove on, you can usually do that. And you can sit at home at night and watch Family Guy, take a filler rod home with you and do that until you can do it while you're making porridge and whistling Dixie and generally thinking of other things at the same time. But that's going to stand you in good stead, because what lets a lot of people down when they first start TIG welding is almost every other process, MIG and stick, oxyacetylene you have to feed rod, but maybe not so fast. What lets a lot of people down is not being able to really feed the wire accurately when it's needed into the puddle, exactly where and when it's needed. And the general rule is that you start feeding wire as soon as you've got a puddle of the size you want. You get that puddle formed fairly quickly. Dip, move, dip, move, dip, move, dip, move, dip, move, dip, move, and extend the wire from your hand as you go. Simple as that.
Again, looks easy. No, it doesn't look easy actually.
Simple as that.
Right. Okay, so the pull on the other side when we weren't, using the fillet.
Yeah.
Right name, right technical term.
Puddle. Yeah.
How's it going to compare now on?
The puddle wants to look the same before you add fully. You want to fairly quickly get the puddle the size and shape you want, the width you want, using the heat as required, and then try and dip that rod right onto the leading edge of the puddle, and then move and try and dip again. You want the rod to actually contact the puddle, not to ball up and melt in the arc. It's easy to tell if you've done that, because you'll see a big ball appear on the end of the rod. Yeah. It wants to actually contact the puddle, and you get a nice little sort of clicking sound, and you can meter it in quite precisely. and with each little move, do a little dip,
Okay.
and we'll see.
We can try.
I mean, most types of joints on thicker material you would need filler for, because you'd start off with a bevel or a gap, so you've got some material missing, so you add the filler,
Right.
either to make the weld slightly thicker than the original, because you often use a slightly weaker filler wire, an under-spec filler wire, or to fill a joint, or to form a fillet or whatever, you use additional metal, normal.
Okay. I'm glad I can re-watch this video. Right, let's give that a go.
Let's try again. Stuck. That's something you'll do quite a bit in the early stages. Okay, did. Push just a little more rod in each time, I think. Yeah, feed positively, yeah. That's looking good. A little bit less gas now as you come. Yeah, oh, not quite that much. That's where you got to get your hand repositioned. That's when it gets harder. Yeah, yeah. A little bit less gas. I can see one thing that's happening there, but it's still getting good. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It is feeding the rod is the hardest
Feeding
bit.
the rod is hard. And when you watch it back, you'll find there's something happened which is a very common mistake that we all did in the beginning, which is that the torch angle has gradually crept like this. Everybody does it.
Yeah.
But when you watch it back, you'll see. But actually, you got enough wire in there. That's a passable weld bead.
Well, first attempt. Second attempt, really. The first one was
not bad at all.
Yeah.
Let's see how that looks.
Okay.
Right, just for kicks, we ought to try welding 2 bits of metal together. So I'll run along this first half and just see how we go. Always feel like you can take a couple of dry runs and get yourself comfortable, get yourself something to prop on, something to slide on. I've got the shakes, probably because the camera's running. Let's see how it goes. Right, I'm just quickly running along here down this gap just to show. Hopefully we can get a reasonably regular dip and move, keep the filler rod shielded, go along. You notice at the end of this weld it starts to get a bit squirrely and spattery in the puddle. That's because the material wasn't as clean as it should have been. The bit we grabbed to weld onto the end wasn't very clean, but just wanted to, you know, end this lesson by joining a couple of pieces of metal together, which is sort of what welding is about in many ways. Anyway, not too bad.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Alright, my bead is a little bit flat there. Could have done with some more filler or thicker wire. And considering it's 5mm plate, I wasn't intending to penetrate, but it almost has. So,
Okay.
not terrible.
See if I can
Not
do any
great.
better then.
See what you can do. Go for it.
Try again.
Yep. So you've got a line to follow now. Sometimes that makes it a bit easier and a bit more intentional. So when it fizzes like that, you're just a little bit on the close side. Yeah, that's better. You can feed a little bit more rod each time. Yeah. What's starting to happen at the end here is we're all getting a little bit tired, and it's all slowed down a bit, and the heat is beginning to build. The puddle is beginning to sink a little bit. It's hard work. There's a lot of things to think about.
Oh, that's very deep, that one. I think I might have welded that to the bench, Aidan.
You got plenty of heat going there. So the more things you get to think about, the as it goes. But
well, that's a fail.
No, that's not too bad. It's better than most people can do the first time. There's a lot of things to think about, and the more you practice, the more one part will come naturally.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't done much better.
It's always harder when the camera's rolling as well.
When the camera's rolling. The more you think, the more you practice feeding with the feed hand, the more that will come naturally, and you'll have time to think about backing off the gas as it gets hotter. You've probably got more. You've probably welded right. You see where the puddle is sunk a little.
Yeah. Well, a little.
You could see that happening towards the end. That tells you to back off the heat a bit, back off the pedal a bit.
It is. There's a lot. Like
you can see that
a lot to think about.
You've penetrated right through, which is good. But it's,
I think it's getting used to the sensitivity of the pedal.
Getting used to the machine.
Yeah, it's going to take some practice. Getting used to feeding that rod in is the hardest thing, I think.
Yeah.
And just getting it's a technique, you know. It's all technique.
I think the thing to do is practice, and watch the welding tips and tricks. We've got excellent videos. 3 things normally go wrong when you're welding. The arc gets too long, the torch gets too much of an angle, and you don't keep the filler rod shielded. This will come, you'll soon get to know that it was getting too hot towards the end. Just lift up on the pedal a bit. Maybe go back to not using filler and practicing some constant beads. Constant width, so you get used to lifting up the gas, and then practice with filler so you get used to feeding.
I think I'm learning to run a bit, maybe for the purpose of the video, to make it a bit more interesting.
Far for this video.
But
go back to basics from time to time and get one variable locked down, and then move on to other things. Looking good. Okay, I hope you guys have really enjoyed watching that. I think we enjoyed making it. We all learned something. We learn stuff every day. And I think that was actually a damn good effort for someone who's never picked up a welding torch of any kind before, to be able to run a passable bead within an hour. I hope he's going to keep practicing, and I hope we'll see good things in the future.